Before we get into our podcast session, I want to personally thank everyone who listens to our podcast, whether you're listening to our sermons or Bible studies or ministerial sessions or other messages or materials that we've put together over the last 20 or more years during the time I pastored the Mansfield Gospel Assembly Church and now the Green Gospel Assembly Church. It's a tremendous blessing and a humbling honor that we have folks who are interested in hearing things that we're studying out or discussing. I want to make sure everyone who listens to our podcast is aware that you can also find many of these studies and messages, whether in video or audio forms, on the church website at greengospelassembly.com. The links to the audio of many of our podcast episodes are arranged there topically, which is a little different than how the podcast publishes them. And there's some older studies there, as well as ongoing studies that we're continuing through right now that are grouped by their series or by the category or subject, which makes it much easier for someone who wants to go through a subject systematically and chronologically. When we publish a new session or a new study of some kind to the podcast, it does it in order of when that happens. So sometimes we can be going through several subjects and we may talk on something that we don't get back to the next session on for a month or more. And there may be other things in between there. So it's a little harder to follow it if you're going to go through it systematically and in order. You can do that, though, on all of our ongoing subjects and some of our more popular subjects like the ministry by going to the church website, and those subjects can be found there. That'll just link you right back to the podcast, but it'll give you those subjects in their series order. The podcast has always been and is still intended to be a non-profit ministry that's part of our church work. And we always want to make sure that the material that we're publishing in this kind of a way is freely and openly available to everyone who would like to listen to it. For that reason, we've resisted the addition of any kind of revenue-producing advertising being added to the podcast. Though as our regular listeners have increased to the numbers where they're at now, we've had numerous offers from advertisers to put advertisements on our podcast. I have no intention of doing that. Instead of allowing ads to be inserted into the podcast, it's our intention to cover its expenses by free will donations and monthly subscriptions that might be given by our listeners. Since we're billed for the number of hours of material that we add monthly, our monthly subscribers are especially important for allowing us to continue to add more podcasts and to do it quickly. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that with a minimal offering. I think it's as low as $3 a month that will help in covering the monthly expenses and continued publication and upgrade of equipment and other things that goes into continuing to keep the podcast going and to do it effectively. You can do that by clicking on the support show link in your podcast player or on the information page that's connected to each episode. Let me say again just how much we appreciate all of those who've been listening to our materials. We started out this ministry for the sake of the people that we work with in other parts of the country that are not local, and for the churches and ministers we work with in other countries outside of the United States. And I have been astonished at how God has blessed it, where we're approaching 250,000 downloads as we came into 2025. Thank you for listening. If you ever have any questions or you ever have any feedback, you can always contact us directly through the link on each podcast episode. God bless and keep each one of you, and I pray that anything that we're presenting or producing will be a benefit to you, whether in the truth that it contains or by causing you to dig a little deeper to test that teaching. Last Wednesday night, we talked some about the 1,260-day prophecies in the Bible that we believe refer to 1,260 years, and I touched on a number of different issues associated with those, including at the end of that service, going into some of the different interpretations for when that 1,260-year period potentially began or ended. I did that so quickly, and I didn't go through all of it, and there were some other issues that I didn't address. So this session that we're recording with some of you brethren who are outside of our local area is going to go into that in more depth It's a little easier to do that with a group that is made up entirely of ministers than it is doing a live service where you got people from a lot of different age ranges and backgrounds, because this is fairly deep material. And when you're going through a lot of what could be technical points at times or dates or different arguments, it can be a little bit overwhelming for a normal audience. But going through it like this with you brethren that are in a ministerial capacity that I work with outside of our area, we can slow this down a little bit and go through all the points regarding the different interpretations of 1260 years and the reasons why I do not hold the common interpretation that some do among our churches, that it is from 538 to 1798 AD. After going through all this, I imagine in one of our future Wednesday night local Bible studies that we've been having, what I'll probably do is just take the key points that we're going to discuss in detail here and reiterate them for the overall congregation and those that are tuning into our services by live stream and in other ways. So if they choose to go back and listen to this session that we're having right now, they can get all the detailed arguments and reasons for the different views. But when I go over that in our next local study, I am not going to go through all those views. I'm only going to note the ones that I think are the most viable, the ones that I think have the most possibility. I'll do that here in this session, but I'll do that in a much more simplified way then, and then that'll allow us to move on in our local studies with the overall subject of the falling away and restoration of the church that we've been talking about. Let me repeat just a couple of the examples I gave on our last Wednesday night study in green. So I'm giving you, brethren, a full list of these different interpretations. When I give these interpretations, it's very important to understand I do not agree with the vast majority of them. I think there's a few different interpretations that might have promise, and there's one or two that I'm going to give in a pretty lengthy list of different possibilities that I think are the most probable. Some have taught that the woman in Revelation 12 that's going into the wilderness is Mary, and that this refers to her and Joseph taking Jesus down to Egypt. It's recorded in Matthew 2:13 to 15. That's the wilderness they took him down to for several years, and then he came back after that time. On one level, that is close to matching the kind of time frame we expect that Jesus' family was in Egypt. But the description of what is occurring in Revelation 12 is far beyond anything that could possibly apply to Mary and Joseph and Jesus in this short sojourn that they took into Egypt, described in Matthew 2. I think that interpretation is almost certainly not the case. If it were the case, it would be a literal fulfillment, meaning instead of the 1260 days being prophetic days, referring to years, someone who would make that argument would say that it was 1260 literal days, 3.5 years that Jesus' family was in Egypt. But again, I think that is highly counter-contextual when you look at everything that's going on in the 12th chapter of Revelation. That does not fit. Another example of a literal fulfillment is the belief that some have had that this 1260-day period is a period of 3.5 years that the Christians fled from Jerusalem during the time of the Jewish-Roman War and went to Pella, Petra, or some other wilderness sanctuary to escape the Jewish-Roman War. Again, though it could be that that would be about the amount of time that some of the Christian Jews might have fled from Jerusalem during that time, it just does not fit the context of the kind of events that we see described in the 12th chapter of Revelation. So it's yet another one that I would rule out. And I'm going to tell you ahead of time, I personally do not see any literal interpretations of this being able to fit contextually. That at some point, something a woman was symbolic of was in these for 3.5 literal years. Another example that I'm going to come back and touch on from a little bit different angle in a few minutes is the belief that this woman is natural Israel. When I say natural Israel, by the way, I don't mean that in the sense that Israelites that are carnal in nature. I just mean the genetic Israelites, the ones who are the children of Israel by natural birth, rather than those who are what you might call spiritual Israelites by spiritual birth. In other words, natural Israel is not the New Covenant Church. Natural Israel are the Old Covenant people of God who did not join the New Covenant Church. Some people think, as I started saying, that this woman's natural Israel and that the 1260-day period began with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD or possibly around the time of or following the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s AD. Bar Kokhba was an individual who many of the Jews believed was the Messiah, and he was defeated in the 130s AD, and it led to even more intensive actions taken against Jews in Israel that pushed them out of their homeland. We've already talked about that one in terms of why the woman here can't be natural Israel. So I'm not going to go into detail with all the reasons for that. You could go back to some of our previous sessions to see why it really isn't rational or biblical to argue that this woman in Revelation 12 is natural Israel. But even if it were the case, that would mean the 1260 days, if they're years, would have ended in around 1330 or 1390 AD. Neither one of those time periods has any significance to some ending of a wilderness period for Israel that would have begun in 70 AD or in the 130s AD. So a key point that we do have to give consideration to is it's not just the beginning point, as I said this last Wednesday night. It's not just the ending point. You might find what you think is a really great beginning point for the 1260 days and say, it has to start at this time because this event that happened is so significant. Well, if you're a good historian, you'll find out there are a lot of events you could make that argument for in the history of the church. And there are many events related to what we think of as the falling away of the church. It's not just one date, like the massively significant date of 325 AD when the Council of Nicaea occurred. There are many dates, and I'll come back to some of those dates in just a little bit here. But before we do so, I want to reiterate this point that much of what we're going to say about the 1260 days is going to be theoretical. In other words, we have to speculate about what we think the beginning and ending points are. Until we know without a shadow of a doubt that the 1260 days ended, and there's such a significant ending to it, that all the things we saw that I talked about last Wednesday night that are supposed to happen inside the 1260 days have happened, and now all the things we would expect to happen after this woman comes out of the wilderness are happening, we can't really make an absolutely dogmatic statement about when this 1260 day or year period began and ended. I do think we can narrow it down, though, to the time periods that are the most likely. And that's my goal in going through a list of these things, is to pick out of the list what are the handful of possible potential interpretations. And then out of that handful, what is most likely. I humbly believe this is going to require a bit of speculation on anyone's part who's trying to match this up. At least trying to match it up to the church. And I do believe the 1260-day period does refer to the church. And there's a reason I said that, because this last interpretation I said is that of people that believe this woman is natural Israel. But there's another way you could approach that as well if you thought that the natural people of Israel are being referred to in some of these 1260-day or year prophecies. And that is that these may be the type of prophecies, at least some of them, that have what we call a dual fulfillment. Now, there is a very good reason why I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes explaining the biblical precedent for this kind of fulfillment. It's because there is a date that is a very significant date on the beginning and the end in the history of Israel that is 1260 years on the nose. And that is that between 687 AD and 691 AD is when the Dome of the Rock was being built by Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan. Now you might say, why would that be an important starting point if natural Israel has a 1260-year period? Well, when you look at almost any picture of Jerusalem, what is the thing that is most noticeable to you that stands out? It's the Dome of the Rock. That pagan Islamic monument is sitting right on top of the Temple Mount and is, in my opinion, one of the most blasphemous things that could possibly be done to Israel. In some ways worse than the destruction of the temple, because not only is the temple no longer there, but with the Dome of the Rock where it is, it would make it very difficult, whether you think the temple was on a different part of that tabletop area or otherwise, it would make it very difficult to ever rebuild the temple. And that's part of the point. Part of the point is that Islam wanted to put their claim on this, and that could have strong parallels with the idea of the Gentiles trotting the holy city underfoot for this period of time, and some of the other parallels about the regathering of Israel, because if you use your math skills right in the midst of the period when the Dome of the Rock was being built, when the primary part of the building was done right around 688 AD, and go forward exactly 1260 years, you get to 1948 AD, which is the year when Israel miraculously became a nation once again. I was very pleasantly surprised that I got a message from one of our brothers, Brother Eric Jones, who brought up this exact time period of 1260 years between 688 when the Dome of the Rock was being built and 1948 when Israel was restored. I did not expect too many people to ever make that connection. We sometimes get tunnel vision when it comes to certain things that we have believed a certain way for a long time. And that can be a dangerous thing when you get tunnel vision based on your traditions, where you've had a tradition that this is how something is supposed to be done, or this is a tradition about what we believe about such and such. Well, the only problem with having tunnel vision of that kind is it may be that there's something that you entirely miss because you refuse to accept that there's anything else to see, or that you could be wrong on something. Now, I want to stress again, I strongly believe the 1260 days talked about in Revelation 12 is talking about a period the church, the New Covenant church, is in the wilderness. The reason I'm going through some of these points that I'm going through is to show that there may also be a somewhat parallel 1260-year period that Israel may be going through, because there are a lot of similarities between Israel and its falling away and apostasies and restorations, and the church's falling away and apostasies and restoration. Maybe there's a 1260-year period for Israel. Now, mind you, I mean that in addition to there being a 1260-year period for the church. I don't mean in replacement of it. I do think there's a 1260-year period for the church, but there may also be a 1260-year period for Israel, and some of those references either might be true of natural Israel, but also true of the spiritual Israel that's the church, or some of them may be about natural Israel, and some of them may be about spiritual Israel. But there is a biblical precedent, as I said, for this kind of interpretation where you might have a prophecy of this kind that's fulfilled multiple times. Just think of the prophetic statement in Hosea 11:1, when the Lord speaks to Hosea and says, "When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt." If you look at the context of that, it's absolutely speaking about what had happened in the past with the nation of Israel. But you're going to find out that that passage is used in Matthew 2:15 to refer to Jesus' family coming out of Egypt, which means it would have to have two fulfillments. It had its original fulfillment when the nation, the corporate child of God, so to speak, came out of Egypt, and later when the preeminent Son of God, Jesus Christ, and his family came out of Egypt. That's not the only example of that in the Bible that gives us a precedent for seeing that some of these prophecies can have dual fulfillments. There's a prophecy that was made by the prophet Jeremiah about Judah being under the judgment of God for 70 years. You can find it in Jeremiah 25:12 and 29:10. The 70-year prophecies that Jeremiah makes sound like they're referring to one 70-year period of judgment that Israel will be under. And you might argue that that's the case, but if you look at the actual history and chronology of what was going on in the 5 and 600s BC, you'll find there were actually two 70-year periods dealing with what appears to be two different things. Around 605 to 606 BC, many of the leaders, especially the young leaders, the young princes and so on, were taken into captivity to Babylon. That's very likely when Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah went into captivity. About 20 years later, after Judah continued to have a rebellious relationship with Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's armies came in and destroyed the city and the temple. That was in 586 BC. If we look at both those dates, the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, which let's use 605 to 606 BC, and the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple of Solomon in 586, you're going to find that there's actually a 70-year period that begins with each of those and ends with a significant event. This is a little detailed, but my point in bringing this up is to show you how there can be a prophecy that says something's going to happen over 70 years that actually is fulfilled in two different ways and in two different times. And that could be a case for how we could teach as we do, and I strongly believe that there's a 1260-year period for the church, while also saying there might be a 1260-year period that Israel was under. And using that example as an extremely precise 1260-year period to get from the time of the building of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount to the time of Israel being restored as a nation and that massive influx of people that began happening at that time. The point being, that could be the natural fulfillment of some of these statements that we see in the Bible in passages like Daniel 12 regarding the scattering of the power of the holy people that you see in Daniel 12:7, or in Revelation 11 when it's talking about the Gentiles trotting the city underfoot. I realize we can spiritualize that and say that that's talking about the paganized leaders of that church controlling the church and holding the people captive until that wilderness period came to an end, which would take a lot more time to get into in depth. And I don't have a problem with that spiritual application. But that also fits well with the natural application. If that's talking about the actual Temple Mount being trodden underfoot by Gentiles, beginning with the establishment of the Dome of the Rock, and then the reversal of that process, beginning with the reconstitution of Israel as a nation in 1948, again, a period of 1,260 years that fits better than most of the theories that I'm going to give you on how the church has a 1,260-year period. Which again, I want to stress, is what I believe. I believe the church does have a 1,260-year period. My point in bringing up some of these other prophecies is to show you that it could also be that Israel has a 1,260-year period, as I just described. But coming back to this example of the 70-year prophecy of Jeremiah, if you start with the time when the Babylonian captivity of Judah actually began, which was around 605 to 606, when they first began taking captives to Babylon, and you go forward 70 years, you're going to come to the end of that period being 535 to 536, which is exactly when the captives started returning to Judah that you see described in Ezra 2, and when the restoration of the temple began, which you see in Ezra 3 that happened in the spring of 535. Which means you could start with 605 to 606, go forward 70 years, and you would find that God is restoring captives back after a 70-year period of captivity. But if you jump forward, as I said, 20 years to 586, when the city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed by Nebuzaradan, Nebuchadnezzar's general, and you took that forward 70 years and said, well, I think the 70-year prophecy begins then, that would also fit well, because in 515 to 516 is when the restoration of the temple was completed. And it's interesting, if you look at the story, that it doesn't seem like the temple wasn't able to be completed until that time, which seems to demonstrate that God allowed it to be stretched out intentionally over what amounts to about 20 years from the time the exiles got back till the time the temple was actually restored, because it fits another 70-year period. So from 605 to 606 to 535 to 536 is a 70-year period that Judah was captive in Babylon. From the time of the first captivity of especially the ruling elite of Judah in Babylon to the time that the captives began to return. From 586 BC to around 515 to 516 BC is another 70-year period that might be more related to a religious judgment on Israel, in that was the period the temple lay in ruins. It was destroyed in 586. It wasn't restored until just after 70 years were completed. The first 70-year period might be what amounts to a civil judgment on the people, the nation, and since they're leaders and so on. And the second 70-year period could be a judgment on the religious element, considering that was the period of the temple being destroyed. Now, I said all that to make this very simple point. Clearly, the Bible can refer to a period of time when a prophecy is being fulfilled. And in the case of the prophecies in Jeremiah 25 and 29 that talk about the 70 years, they actually could fit two different time periods. And I happen to personally think they do fit those two different time periods. It was going to be 70 years from the beginning of captives being taken to Babylon to the time that captives would be released. And 20 years later, another 70-year period would occur where it lasted from the time of the destruction of the temple and the city all the way up to the time when the temple was fully restored. That alone would give you enough, I think, of a biblical precedent to argue that maybe we ought to at least consider the possibility that the 1,260 years might also have two fulfillments, a 1,260-year fulfillment for natural Israel and a 1,260-year fulfillment for what some call spiritual Israel, the New Covenant Church. There's another example, though, that ties right to my last example. The prophecies that are made in the Bible about the destruction of the city and temple of Jerusalem that were fulfilled in 586 BC have strong similarities, if not intentional parallels, with what happened in 70 AD when the city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed again. Which means you might argue that some of those prophecies had a dual fulfillment, where they were talking about the destruction of the city and the temple, and it happened in 586, and maybe the very same prophecy could be applicable in 70 AD. Another parallel to this, the fact that there's prophecies about the restoration of Israel as a genetic people that do appear at different times to have deeper spiritual fulfillments in the New Covenant Church being restored. What I mean by that is, there's times that there's a prophecy made talking about Israel being restored, where some of the language of that prophecy seems to fit perfectly with the process through which the church will be restored. Now, I don't think that means the church just suddenly replaces everything that's being said to Israel, because some of those prophecies are very specific in ways that can only be fulfilled in regard to natural Israel. But I think what that might mean is there is an overlapping of those prophecies with both, or they have a dual fulfillment where there's a natural fulfillment in the nation of Israel and there's a spiritual fulfillment in the church. I said something earlier about how there are strong parallels at times between the falling away and the apostasies that Israel committed and Israel's restoration and the falling away and apostasy that occurred in the New Covenant Church and the New Covenant Church's restoration. By the way, I wouldn't start studying that by looking at scriptures about the restoration of Israel and seeing if they could fit with the church. That's good to do because there are some that definitely seem to be describing what the church went through. Instead of that, I would start with something very simple. Look at the way Babylon is discussed in the Bible, because Babylon is undeniably a picture of false religion. So going all the way back to what we were talking about here just a couple of minutes ago in Judah's return from Babylon after the Babylonian captivity, the Jews were taken away captive and they lived for some time in natural Babylon, some of them for 70 years, some of them potentially for 50 years, depending on which wave of captivity they went into. But after the period of their captivity was over, a remnant of the Jews were restored back to Judah. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is because we see statements being made in the book of Revelation telling God's people, you can see especially in Revelation 18:4, to come out of Babylon. I don't think that's talking about the natural people of Judah, but it's the very same language that you see being used for the prophecies about the natural people of Judah coming out of natural Babylon back in the 500s BC. But between 500 and 600 years later, that prophecy is going out again to God's people. And so Babylon and God's people in Babylon by themselves seem to strongly imply that you can have this kind of dual fulfillment where there's a prophecy about the natural people of Israel going into Babylon, and then there's a prophecy about the church going into Babylon. Babylon, by the way, was undoubtedly a literal historical place. But the term Babylon is also used for a place of spiritual darkness and apostasy and false religion where God's people, not just Israel going into their captivity in the 500 and 600s BC, but also the church is described as being captive in a spiritual sense later in history. There's some prophecies about Babylon that were literally fulfilled in Judah's historic past, but parts of those same prophecies strongly appear to have spiritual applications of the church falling away and being restored out of Babylon and or in contrast to Babylon. And they make it clear, by the way, Babylon will not be restored. Jeremiah 51, 8-9 says, Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Howl for her, take balm for her pain. If so be she may be healed. We would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed. Forsake her and let us go every one into his own country, for her judgment reacheth unto heaven and is lifted up even to the skies. Now here's what I think is very interesting about that statement. That does not sound like the kind of statement that the natural Jews would be making about natural Babylon. Why they would want natural Babylon to be healed is beyond me. Why would you want Babylon to continue to be a strong nation or to survive defeat by another nation, especially after the way Babylon treated them? But if you make this into a spiritual fulfillment in regard to the church, it fits perfectly. Because when the reformers started to strike their blows against Babylon, and Babylon was knocked down, at least for a time, by the work of the Reformation, they didn't start out trying to destroy Babylon, that Roman church, which is what Babylon pictures. They didn't start out trying to forsake Babylon either. They wanted to heal Babylon. They wanted to reform her. That's why we believe not only in reformation, which is a good beginning point, we believe in the more complete and exhaustive concept of restoration, not just reforming something that may be so polluted it can't be fixed. We are trying to restore something that was the original, which is not what the Babylonish Roman Church is. It is not the original. It's been so polluted from what the original was, it cannot be fixed, which I think is exactly what this prophecy in Jeremiah is talking about when it says, we would have healed Babylon. You read the story of the initial reformers, they weren't trying to leave the Roman Church. They were trying to have a revival in the Roman Church that would change the things they thought were wrong. They thought most of what the Roman Church was doing, by the way, was right. And the further back you go in terms of the ones closest to leaving that church, like Luther and so on, the more of Babylon's doctrine they held on to. And they didn't truly forsake her. They might have left the church and started another church, but they took so much of her pollutions with them that they became harlot daughters of the mother of harlots. By the way, if Babylon's called the mother of harlots, it has to tell you there are daughters. And if that mother is a church, the daughters would be churches. And so all those churches that held on to so much of Babylon's order and doctrine, they might have left Babylon when they realized they couldn't heal her because she can't be healed. It can't be fixed to look like the original anymore. It's too polluted. But they didn't really forsake her, as this command is that God tells them to forsake her. You might say they left her, but they didn't forsake her order. They didn't forsake her doctrine. Much of it they held on to. The bottom line point of that is Babylon cannot be healed. It has to be left behind, which is exactly why we see in Revelation 18:4 the statement, come out of her, and it's talking about Babylon, my people. You can't stay in there and fix it. You have to come out. Let me give you two examples of this kind of language in Isaiah, which is 200 years before the time of Jeremiah, and at least 100 years when he made these prophecies before the first captives went into Babylon. The reason that's interesting is because Jews being in Babylon wasn't an issue in Isaiah's day like it clearly was in Jeremiah's. So the very fact that he's talking about going forth out of Babylon tells you that as a future fulfillment. And I don't think it's just talking about the Jews in the 500s BC coming out of Babylon. I think these statements about Babylon are talking about the church coming out of her, which comes right back to our subject of the falling away and restoration of the church. Once the church has fallen away, the only way to restore it is to get as far as you can from the church that fell away, in every sense of that expression. Isaiah 48:20 says, go ye forth of Babylon, flee ye from the Chaldeans. Isaiah 52:11 says, depart ye, go ye out from thence, touch no unclean thing, go ye out of the midst of her, be ye clean that bear the vessels of the Lord. The only way to be clean if you're in the midst of that unclean place is to get out of there. Jeremiah 58 says, remove out of the midst of Babylon, go forth out of the land of the Chaldeans, and be as the he-goats before the flocks, meaning set the example, take the lead, be the first to do it, get out of there, and maybe others will follow you. Jeremiah 51:6 says, flee out of the midst of Babylon and deliver every man his soul. Be not cut off in her iniquity, for this is the time of the Lord's vengeance. He will render unto her a recompense. You look at those statements in Jeremiah, which are undoubtedly talking about natural Babylon in the 500s BC, which was defeated by Persia, by the way, not long after this. And these prophecies were fulfilled in a literal sense. But these are exactly the same kind of words you see in Revelation 17 and 18 about spiritual Babylon, which comes back to my point that there clearly is more than one fulfillment when it comes to certain prophecies. There was a dual fulfillment. You see it in Jeremiah 51:45 when he tells them to come out of the midst of her, and 51:49 to 50 when he talks about Babylon and leaving her behind. And remember the Lord afar off and let Jerusalem come into your mind, which not only is true of the natural Israelites who had to leave Babylon behind, but it's true of us as the spiritual children of God, that if we want to leave Babylon behind, we've got to turn our back on her and turn our face towards Jerusalem, which is above, turn our face towards spiritual Jerusalem, not spiritual Babylon. Though those prophecies I was just referencing were fulfilled in the defeat of Babylon by the Medes and the Persians in the 500s BC, God uses that exact same kind of description of Babylon and of his people leaving Babylon and of Babylon being judged in Revelation 17 and 18, as I just said. And I mentioned that Revelation 18:4 essentially is quoting these statements, which means they clearly have a dual fulfillment. And by the way, the second fulfillment would have to be at least 2,000 years after the first fulfillment, because they left Babylon in the 500s BC. And the church did not start leaving the Roman church in any large-scale sense until the 1500s BC, which means 2,000 years are between just those two events. The reason for all of that being to demonstrate that it is very possible. Some of the passages about the 1260-year period, whether it's called 1260 days or however it might be referenced, could be talking about Israel, and some could be talking about the church, or they could be overlapping one another, where there's a true dual fulfillment of some of those statements. That Israel has a period like that, and that the church has a period like that uses some of the same language for those periods, that has dual fulfillments.